Most of us believe Nokron ended up underground because that's exactly what Elden Ring wants you to believe. The game tells us the Noks were banished beneath the lands between, and somewhere along the way almost everyone, including me, started treating that as a proof that every Eternal City must have once stood beneath the open sky before being swallowed by the earth. But I think we've accidentally merged 3 different historical events into one simple story. We've treated Nokron, Nokstella and the Nameless Eternal City as like they all shared the same fate. And once I stopped making that assumption, the evidence started pointing toward a city that was built there from the beginning. Now that is a dangerous claim to make, because there is evidence that the Eternal City suffered catastrophic punishment. There are item descriptions that seem to support the traditional interpretation, and by the end of this video I will address what I think is the most strongest arguments against my current theory. But before we get there, I want to do something surprisingly simple. I want to ignore the accepted timeline, I want to ignore years of community consensus, and I want to look at Nokron exactly the way From Software designed us to, by walking through it. The starting point is a simple question. If Nokron really crashed beneath the earth, why does everything about it looks like it belonged here? It sounds obvious at first, of course, an underground city would look underground, except that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether it looks adapted to the underground or designed for it, because those are 2 completely different ideas. Nokron is connected to the surface through not 1 but 2 separate wells, both unmistakably built in Noxt architectural style. They are not directly connected today, but the clarity leads toward the same underground civilization. Rather than looking like emergency escape roads created after a disaster, they resemble carefully planned infrastructure linking 2 worlds together. At first I dismissed that detail, and then I realized something. If Nokron had simply been dragged underground as punishment, why would the civilization immediately invest enormous resources into building monumental elevators back to the surface? And why would those structures feel like permanent landmarks instead of desperate repairs? That question led me deeper into the city, and that is where things became much harder to ignore. The Siofra Aqueduct is one of the most overlooked structures in Elden Ring. It is beautiful, it's massive, and somehow almost nobody talks about what it implies. Because the aqueduct doesn't look temporary, it doesn't look improvised. It doesn't feel like engineers desperately trying to survive after a catastrophe. It feels foundational. Everything around it seems organized because the aqueduct exists. The bridges align naturally with the terrain, the waterways feel intentional. Entire districts appear planned around the underground rivers rather than awkwardly forced into them. Imagine walking through a medieval city that had suddenly fallen into a cave. What would you expect to see? Collapsed foundations, roads cut off by rock, building twisted into impossible positions, architecture constantly fighting the landscape around it. Instead, Nokron almost feels comfortable, like it understands the environment around it, like its builders has expected these rivers to be here long before the first stone was ever placed. That's not proof, but it's an evidence. And evidence matters most when it forces us to ask better questions. One of the strongest counter-arguments I've seen is that we're simply looking at a city that adapted after its punishment. That explanation sounds perfectly reasonable, until you start paying attention to scale. We're not talking about a few rebuilt houses, we're talking about monumental engineering projects. Massive bridges, integrated waterways, entire neighborhoods that seem planned around natural caverns. Cities don't reinvent themselves like the overnight, civilizations do. And if Nokron truly transformed itself into an underground masterpiece after being banished, then we're no longer talking about a city that merely survived disaster. We're talking about generations of builders who embraced underground life as though they'd always intended to be there. Ironically, that explanation begins sounding remarkably similar to the theory it's trying to disapprove. Most of the obvious destruction inside Nokron isn't spread evenly across the city, it's concentrated. Near the Deep Siofra Wells, buildings lean at impossible angles. Stonework is fractured, entire sections appear violently displaced. What if this damage wasn't caused by the city falling underground? What if it was caused by whatever disconnected Nokron from the surface? In that case, the next question appears: what broke the connection between Nokron and the surface? The more time I spent walking through Nokron, the more it felt like a civilization that understood the underground better than the surface. Almost every structure reinforces that impression. The rivers don't interrupt the city, they define it. The cavern isn't an obstacle, it's a part of a blueprint. The architecture doesn't fight the landscape, it grows from it. At this point, I still wasn't convinced Nokron had always been underground, but I was convinced of something else. The accepted explanation suddenly felt far less certain than I'd always believed. I started noticing something even stranger, because Nokron isn't the only Eternal City, and the moment you compare it to others, the entire theory starts to fall apart. The accepted timeline usually sounds something like this. The Nox angered the Greater Will. The Eternal Cities were banished underground. End of story. But look across the lands between. Every major civilization falls differently. Farum Azula doesn't disappear the same way Leyndell changes. The Shadow Realm doesn't resemble the destruction of Saelid. The Helic Tree's tragedy isn't the same as Volcano Manor's. Every civilization has its own scars. So why have we always assumed every Eternal City experienced the exact same punishment? Let's compare. Nokron versus the Nameless Eternal City. At first they seem almost identical. Both belong to the Nox. Both exist beneath the surface. Both contain familiar architecture, but the Nameless Eternal City feels broken. Not simply ruined, but broken. Its districts don't flow together naturally. Large sections feel fragmented, disconnected, almost as if the city itself had been interrupted. Even its placement beneath Leyndell feels unusual. Unlike Nokron, there are no monumental wells creating obvious connections to the surface. Instead, it sits beneath a massive body of land, almost like something was sealed away or buried. That doesn't prove the city literally sank, but it certainly creates a different impression. It feels like a place where something happened. Nokron, on the other hand, feels like a place where life continued. Even in ruin, it feels organized. Its roads still make sense, its bridges still connect meaningful locations. Its relationship with Siofra River appears deliberate rather than accidental. One city feels interrupted, the other one feels inhabited. That's a subtle distinction that has a lot of different opinions in Elden Ring lore community. We may believe only the Nameless Eternal City truly collapsed. Others may argue Astel destroyed it. Some may propose it was buried beneath what eventually became Leyndell. Others connect it with the mysterious city known as Nokstella. Almost nobody agreed on how it reaches its current state, but nearly everyone treated it differently from Nokron. That alone should make us pause. Dozens of different theories naturally separate one city from another. Perhaps the cities themselves are asking to be understood separately. Then there is Nokstella, and honestly, Nokstella complicates everything. Because if Nokron slowly pulled me away from the accepted timeline, Nokstella kept dragging me back toward it. We'll get to the Black Moon shortly. It's the strongest objection to everything I've argued so far. But before we even reach that evidence, Nokstella already feels different. Its architectural layout isn't identical. Even its position inside Ainsel River tells a different story. All this made me start thinking about the Eternal Cities less like copies and more like siblings. They share ancestry, not identical lives. Real siblings don't experience history the same way, neither do civilizations. This changed the way I interpreted the sentence that is repeated through Elden Ring lore. The Nox were banished underground. I read that sentence literally. The cities went underground. But language doesn't always describe geography. Sometimes it describes power. Imagine a kingdom with territories both above and below the earth. Imagine that kingdom loses every surface possession. Its castles influence political authority, its access to the world above. Would history remember that civilization as being banished underground? I think it would, even if parts of that civilization had always existed below the surface. That possibility kept bothering me because it solves several problems at once. It explains why Nokron appears perfectly adapted to the underground life. It explains why the Nox continue existing instead of vanishing entirely. And most importantly, it doesn't require every Eternal City to share one identical story. Instead, the punishment becomes political before it becomes geological. The civilization loses surface, the underground becomes everything that remains. Suddenly the phrase "banished underground" feels more broader than I'd always imagined. At this point I was honestly leading toward the idea that the Nokron had always been underground in Elden Ring. The architecture supported it, the geography supported it, separating the histories of the Eternal Cities supported it. Everything seemed to fit surprisingly well. And then I reached the one piece of evidence I couldn't explain away, the evidence that almost convinced me I was wrong. Because if there's one thing that refuses to cooperate with the entire theory, it's a black moon. And if the black moon means what most people think it means, then everything I've argued so far falls apart. This is a point where I expected the entire theory to collapse. For most of my investigation, Nokron kept pulling me in one direction. The architecture looked intentional, the underground rivers felt planned. The city's relationship with Siofra seemed fundamental instead of accidental. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Then I remembered the Black Moon, and suddenly none of this seemed to matter anymore. Because of Nokstella once had a moon hanging above it, and if the fragments of that moon became the memory stone scattered across the lands between, then how could Nokstella have always been underground? More importantly, if Nokstella wasn't underground, what should Nokron have been? This is easily the strongest objection to everything I've argued. Not because it disapproves Nokron directly, but because it forces us to ask whether all of the Eternal Cities shared the same history after all. The descriptions surrounding the moon of Nokstella are next. A moon hangs above a city, that moon shatters. Its fragments are found across the surface world. If that is true, then at least one Eternal City must once have existed beneath an open sky. I have to admit, this description made me consider the entire investigation finished. It felt decisive, elegant, almost impossible to argue against. But then I noticed something strange. Even if every part of that argument is true, it still isn't talking about Nokron. It's talking about Nokstella. And that is an incredibly important distinction. Because somewhere along the way I had quietly fallen back into the same assumption I was trying to challenge. I had started treating every Eternal City as through proving something about one automatically proved something about all of them. Just separate the cities again and the contradiction almost disappeared. Suppose Nokstella really did exist beneath the open sky. Suppose the Black Moon truly hung above it. Suppose its fragments genuinely scattered across the lands between. None of those ideas automatically explain how Nokron was built. They explain Nokstella, not Nokron. We should just start asking which Eternal Cities were above ground. I've also met some other fascinating interpretations, even though I'm not completely convinced by it. Some Elden Ring lore investigations argue that the Black Moon itself may not have been a real celestial body at all. Instead, they suggested it could have been another artificial creation of the Nox, a counterpart to their false night skies, a recreation of something they had already lost rather than proof of where they once lived. Personally, I think this explanation asks us to make more assumptions than necessary. The item descriptions naturally read as through Black Moon once existed. Trying to reinterpret it as an entirely artificial object risks creating a new mystery just to solve the old one. Whenever I personally study From Software's lore, I try to avoid explanations that multiply assumptions. Usually the strongest theory is the one that requires the fewest moving parts. That's why I don't think the artificial moon idea is the strongest answer. But I also don't think it needs to be, because there is another possibility that is much simpler. What if the Black Moon is telling the truth, and Nokron still never fell? Those two ideas aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they may fit together surprisingly well. Imagine a Nox civilization that already possessed underground settlements. Imagine Nokron serving as one of those ancient domains long before the Greater Will's punishment. Then imagine another city, perhaps Nokstella, maintaining stronger ties to the surface world. When catastrophe finally came, their histories naturally diverged. One city remained where it had always been, another lost the sky above it. A third was shattered almost beyond recognition. Suddenly the Eternal Cities stopped behaving like copies. They begin behaving like real civilizations, connected, related, but shaped by different disasters. Ironically, this explanation actually requires fewer assumptions than insisting every city experienced the exact same event. And that's when I realized something I hadn't expected. The strongest evidence against my theory never actually disproved my central claim. It only disproved a claim I wasn't making. It wasn't arguing that every Eternal City had always been underground. It was arguing that Nokron may have been. Those are two completely different arguments. The Black Moon challenges one, it doesn't necessarily challenge the other. By now I felt like the puzzle pieces were finally beginning to fit together. The architecture made sense, the geography made sense. The differences between the Eternal Cities suddenly felt meaningful instead of contradictory. Even the Black Moon had found its place within the larger picture. There is only one question left. If Nokron really was designed for underground life, then what exactly did the Great Will take away from the Nox? Because maybe, just maybe, we've misunderstood the punishment itself. But it's definitely a matter of another Elden Ring lore series video investigation. So, thanks for watching, hit that like button and subscribe for more Elden Ring and other Souls-like games, lore and guide videos, and stay sharp out there, Tarnished.